for. Because that's
You're still in the right place.
yes. Do stay because we have snacks. So for new faces here, I'm Grayson Hancock. I'm the secretary. That's Devin Fish over there, the president. And back from New Zealand, Mason Thomas, our vice president.
Hey!
So we have just a few announcements. The first is that we won't be meeting next Monday because it's MLK Day. So enjoy that time off. We will be whiteboarding not this Friday, but next Friday. And the question, we're still sorting it out because the next talk that following Monday will be Dr. Daryl Doyama on the ontological argument, which that's a difficult one to make a question for. So we're still working on it. But we also have a poll in the GroupMe, and if you're not in the GroupMe, find someone who is so you can get in there. That is asking about what times is or works best for each of y'all for whiteboarding. Like, would it be, right, Devin, just like Friday, different days, different times? Yeah, so fill that out so we can just know like when the best time to schedule that would be. But for now, we're doing Friday. We have Dr. Ike Shepardson, who I think is in the bathroom right now, but he is here. And he's going to be talking about some pretty cool stuff, the Nuremberg trials. I'll let him talk a little bit more about that soon when he gets back, but I'll pray us in and then, what was this?
So Ike Shepardson just co-authored a book with Melissa Kane Travis, which you're seeing right here. This is the cover of the new book. It doesn't release on Amazon until like February, but there he is, and he can tell us a little bit more about the new book.
Hey. On?
You're on.
All right, yeah. Very
Just
good.
a little bit about here.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so a lot of apologetics is predicated on the idea of you should give positive evidences for the truth and rationality of Christian faith. And I'm all about that. In fact, you guys have had me come in before to talk about those kinds of things. And tonight I'll even get into a little bit of things with respect to the moral argument. But one thing I was noticing is a big gap is that there are more and more objections to Christian faith that are voiced in a more of a negative fashion. And you see some of them that I've listed here. There's a lot more. There's 11 chapters in the book where we talk about the kinds of challenges that people bring up against Christianity. Is it true that Christians are all racist and colonialistic about our faith? That is Christianity the white man's religion, right? Those kinds of things matter. And so this book is really dedicated to this. I've written this with Melissa Kane Travis. She's a philosopher of science who's affiliated with the Discovery Institute and teaches philosophy at Houston Christian University. So I mean, I hope it's a helpful book. I don't make a lot of money off the book, so I don't mind plugging it. Here's a QR, and if you use this promo code, it's cheaper, and it releases next month.
Okay, sounds pretty cool. So get your phones out and scan that. But I'll pray us in and then I'll hand it off. Dear God, thank you for just bringing us all back for another semester at Mines. I just pray that you'll bless our time this semester and just give us good focus and wisdom in our classes. God, I pray that you'll just bless the talk tonight and that you'll just help Dr. Shepardson with just delivering all of his points and doing it in a way that honors you and just brings out the truths behind the way that you've just made the world and your goodness and the morality that you've put within our hearts. God, I just pray that you open our ears and our hearts to receive your truths and that you can just allow us to talk about these things with others and lead others to you. In your holy name I pray. Amen.
Did you mention the outline?
Oh, yes, on the GroupMe. Dr. Shepardson has an outline that we have uploaded there, so if you want to pull that up to follow
Just
along.
on the GroupMe.
Yes, that'll be helpful.
All right, for those of you who I don't know yet, my name is Ike Shepardson. I run the Master of Arts program in apologetics at Colorado Christian University. I also am the Chief of Christian Integration and Discovery at Valor Christian High School. So campus ministry is a lot of what I do down there. I'm a Colorado native. Grew up here in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. I went to Regis University. I hope that means we can still be friends. Studied philosophy of religion under Doug Roadheis at Denver Seminary, and then under an atheist named Don Weeb, who's an advocate for the scientific study of religion at the University of Toronto. That's where I did my PhD studies. Today I want to talk about the conquest of morality, the triumphs of history, and the emergence of goodness. All of you probably have heard the famous adage, history is written by the victors. But when we think about our moral intuitions, is it then also the case that our morals are the result of the conquest of one moral vision over another through force? Are our moral laws, so-called, simply an accident of history? This lecture was predicated from, or at least inspired by, the release of the movie Nuremberg, which details some the trial of Nazi high command at the close of the Second World War. The movie focuses on Hermann Goering, who was the Reichsmarschall, second in charge in Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, and his relationship, Goering's relationship with an Allied appointed psychologist named Douglas Kelly. That's a true story, more or less. Now the Allies, what they wanted to ensure is that after they had captured the Nazi high command, they wanted to make sure that the Nazi high command, these people wouldn't commit suicide and that they were fit to stand trial. The idea was that we didn't want to just execute our enemies, but we wanted to recognize when genuine crimes had been committed and provide a fair trial, and then of course, then execute our enemies. So the Allies appointed psychiatrists to ensure that the Nazi high command was mentally fit to stand trial and that they wouldn't hurt themselves. Well, Douglas Kelly, this Allied psychiatrist, he wants to use his assignment to Goering as a chance to uncover what is it exactly that makes somebody do such evil things. So he's looking at this like a scientist. From a scientific perspective, what is evil? And what causes people to behave in such a way? What made them evil and why are they the way that they are? What could so possess someone as to make them participate in and advance the conquest of a continent and the murder of millions? Well, the key moment in the movie, and I'm not going to give anything away because this moment is in all the trailers, so you could have seen this anyway, is when the gruesome video evidence of the Holocaust is played out in the courtroom in Nuremberg. The extermination camps are shown in all of their detail, and it's incredibly emotional and grotesque. Goering acts as if he didn't know the extermination camps existed, which is a little bit difficult to believe given that he's second in charge in the Nazi Empire. He says he didn't know about the camps, and then Douglas Kelly comes to Goering's cell after that day in court and confronts him about this day. Kelly says this, he says, "How was that possible? How was that possible?" Goering replies, "Himmler."
Yeah.
Himmler was, Kelly says, "Himmler was second in command, or wasn't second in command. You were. There were 1,200 camps. What am I supposed to believe, that he didn't know?" Goering says, "Anyone can fake an atrocity." Kelly, "So you're saying the film was a fake? That's your defense?" Goering, "What would you have me say?" Kelly, "How about the truth for once?" Goering, "You think American bullets and bombs don't kill people? You vaporize 150,000 Japanese at the touch of a button and you presume to stand in judgment on me for my crimes." Kelly, "We had every right to defend ourselves." Goering, "How do you defend yourself on someone else's soil?" Kelly, "There's a difference between us bombing war factories and civilians dying as collateral damage and you building 1,200 human slaughterhouses designed to exterminate an entire race, and you know it." Goering, "What do you think war is?" Kelly, "Not what I thought today." Goering, "What do you think the Russians do to German prisoners of war?" You have your freedom, and I'm a prisoner because you've won and we lost. Not because you are morally superior. This trial will be a farce in 15 years. Great conquerors are not thought of as murderers. So the key question for today is, are our conceptions of morality simply a result of the accidents of history? Is there such a thing as objective morality? Or are our moral intuitions simply the result of the fact that through force, one moral vision has conquered another? So what I want to do to talk about this topic today is I want to talk about some examples of the history of what I will call moral conquest. I'll give you a few examples of that. We'll talk about history. If history wasn't your favorite class, that's okay. We'll get through that very quickly. History was my first degree. I love it. And then I want to talk about how it is that we can, if we were to accept the principle that might makes right, how it is that there are actually some key absurdities that result from that. And then I'll end with a little bit of a section on the gospel. So let me give you a few examples from history. The history of moral conquest. Let's start with this idea that we have in the modern West today that kings have limits to their power. Where does this moral intuition come from? Well, one might say that this is actually an innovation. It hasn't always been believed that there should be some kind of natural check or limit to royal power. This intuition that we all have, that kings shouldn't have unlimited power, one might say comes to us through the accidents of history. Consider the dispute between King John of England and the English barons in the 13th century. Those of you who know your English history will know that the Plantagenet kings of England, from the time of William the Conqueror, all the way through the time of Richard the Lionheart and his weaker successor and brother, John, they ruled England, and they also ruled large parts of France, Western France in particular. Now, the King of France had defeated John's forces in battle in France, and John was about to lose the Plantagenet Empire in France. So what does John do? He raises taxes on the English barons, puts an additional tax burden on them in order to finance wars on the continent. This put considerable pressure on the English barons, who then rebelled against John's rule. We don't want to pay your taxes, John. And they defeated John's forces in battle and forced him to sign what we now call Magna Carta, the Great Charter, that limits royal power and encoded into English law the principle that the king does not have the say to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants it. Now, the subsequent history of Magna Carta is actually kind of complex. John got the Pope to repudiate the charter, and so it was nullified for a time. But then eventually, Magna Carta becomes part of English law. It became sort of accepted that the king had to answer to the barons. And that's a principle that leads to the development of parliaments and those kinds of things over time. Now, this becomes a feature of the English political worldview, a worldview of which we are heirs here in the United States. So the conclusion would be that those who have inherited an Anglo-American worldview with respect to politics hold a moral principle to be sacred, that government ought not to have absolute power. Well, one could very simply say, what if the barons had lost? Would we have such a moral intuition? It's possible. There's nothing necessary about the development of history that leads us to believe that liberal democracies are necessarily the right way to go. But here we are, having the moral intuitions that we have about political life. The king ought not to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants it. And that, you might say, is the result of some of the accidents of history. Let's give another example. The abolition of the slave trade. I'm going to particularly talk about the British abolition of the slave trade. There were two acts that abolished first the slave trade in Britain in 1807, and then slavery in Britain and all her colonies in 1834. Well, one of the things that's interesting about how these acts were enforced by the British is that they looked not just to free slaves and stop slave trade, they were actually willing to actively participate in the enforcement of these laws. This wasn't just a kind of virtue signaling, such as it might be called today, of the colonialistic world. Britain put their men at risk in order to enforce the end of the slave trade, and they spent quite a bit of their annual budget. Estimates are about 1/3 of Parliament's annual budget went to enforce a ban on slavery in the British Empire. 1/3 of their budget for a number of years in the 19th century. They used this money to pay sailors and soldiers to arrest slave traders, and they also used this to compensate slave owners. If you owned slaves, you could get Parliament to pay you money for your slaves to be freed. But even, not just in the British Empire, Parliament went a little bit further. They even paid Portugal and Spain to stop their trade in humans. That's very unique. One sovereign nation paying another to no longer keep slaves. It's an interesting thing, interesting idea. The British started the West Africa Squadron of the Royal Navy to hunt down ships trading in humans in order to enforce their abolitionism at the end of the canon and with British lives at stake. And the historian Ellen Castello says it this way. She says, over 60 years or so of patrolling the Atlantic, some 17,000 sailors died. Some killed in action, some from the same diseases as the slaves they freed, including fever, dysentery, yellow fever, and malaria. You guys have a question back there?
Oh, no, I was just simply pointing out that in the Confederates' Constitution, slave trade was also banned.
Interesting. Yeah. So this figure, 17,000 sailors died. This is interesting because it represented one sailor's life lost for every 9 slaves freed.
Mm.
So the British Empire was willing to spend quite a bit of their annual budget and a lot of military lives to make sure slavery was ended. So the conclusion is, one might say, that in the West we hold the belief that slavery anywhere and everywhere is immoral, and one ought to use all means available in order to end the practice. Of course, what if the acts had not been passed? What if slavery had not been made illegal in the British Empire? Perhaps today Spain and Portugal still practice slavery. Maybe there wouldn't have been as much pressure. One of the things that's interesting about this with respect to the American Civil War is that slavery was made illegal in Canada. And that meant that there was a greater conflict that was created naturally by American slaves escaping the South and trying to flee into Canada. Not only did this cause problems with the Confederacy forming an alliance with Britain, that was an issue, but it also caused issues with runaway slave laws in the northern states, which led to a number of judicial and legislative disputes that preceded the Civil War. So, what if this had not been the case? There's nothing necessary that you would say history must have developed this way over time. Maybe Wilberforce and others would have lost their day in Parliament. They wouldn't have voted to ban the slave trade and then subsequently slavery. It could have been otherwise, is what I'm telling you. And perhaps we wouldn't have the moral intuition that we have today. Slavery anywhere and everywhere is wrong, and one ought to use whatever means necessary to end its practice. You and I should know that we could have believed differently than we do. One more example, just because I love history, is the rival political visions at the end of World War II. Those of you who know the history of the Second World War know that at the end of the war, in Europe especially, this is what we're talking about, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones. In the east, it was a Soviet zone, and then there were American, British, and French zones in the west, and those zones eventually were collapsed into one. So there were two occupation zones in Germany. The East became a puppet state to the Soviet Union, where communism became the form of government, and the West was a place where free elections were allowed, and they quickly adopted a Western-style democracy. Well, a couple of conclusions you could run out from this is West Germans, they developed the belief, a moral intuition about political life, that the right kind of government was some kind of democratic liberalism with limited state control over both economics and expression. A rival political and moral vision developed in the East. That communism was the best form of government, and its implementation justified suspension of various forms of political and economic expression. You could have been born in the East, you could have been born in the West. Your moral intuitions, one might say, are shaped by the accidents of history, where you happen to be. Which moral vision was enforced at the tip of a sword? Well, the history of the world, particularly in these Western examples, shows us that power is used to enforce various moral beliefs. And the establishment of political power is surely part of the story of how our moral intuitions and beliefs are formed. However, does it then follow that since political power encodes and enforces various moral beliefs, that what is moral is the result of political decisions? I'll ask that question again. Does it follow that since political power encodes and enforces various moral beliefs, that therefore what is moral is the result of political decisions? Well, I think if you believe the answer to that question is yes, there's two absurdities that result from this. So this is the section 2 absurdities resulting from the notion that might makes right. Remember the key question. Are our moral intuitions and conceptions of morality simply the result of the accidents of history? Is there such a thing as objective morality? Or are our moral intuitions simply the result of the fact that one moral vision has conquered another? What's at stake here is the existence of objective moral values and duties. Are our beliefs about objective morality merely the result of historical process? I don't think so. If you want to believe, as Hermann Goering did, that the only reason that he was considered evil was that the Allies won and Germany lost, I think you're committed to a couple of resulting absurdities. Absurdity number 1. What is believed to be moral is the same thing as what is moral. Of course, it's true that many moral standards differ from culture to culture, time to time. That's true. However, this is a descriptive thesis about the history of morality. It's a descriptive thesis. What is believed to be moral differs from culture to culture, time to time. This is different than what we call a normative thesis. A normative thesis says that what is moral differs from culture to culture and age to age. The descriptive thesis is just good anthropology. If you study people's, you come to the conclusion, people have different takes on things. That's not actually that profound, just being a good anthropologist. But the normative thesis that what is moral differs from culture to culture and age to age, that's moral relativism. Okay, that's what we call moral relativism. It's a kind of moral philosophy. On the one hand, we have anthropology. On the other hand, we have philosophy. They're two different disciplines. The normative thesis does not follow from the descriptive thesis. To say that because what is believed to be moral differs from culture to culture and age to age, and therefore that what is moral differs from culture to culture and age to age, commits a fallacy that we call begging the question. It begs the question of the very issue that we are trying to investigate, the nature of morality itself. The normative thesis assumes that what is moral depends on what is believed to be moral. So not only do you have to have the descriptive thesis, you have to have a dependency thesis that ties the two together. Well, the establishment of that dependency thesis is exactly what the question is trying to determine. And therefore, cultural relativism begs the question on this score. If you want to see more about this, you can look at the book that I've noted here. There's some other problems that result from moral relativism. The first problem would be that criticisms of other cultures is impossible. You would say, as Goering did, German war leaders were simply obeying German laws, and it's true. They were doing what the law said. They were executing what was written in the law and what was given to them by properly constituted political authorities in their country. And yet what was argued at Nuremberg, which is something that's interesting about this trial, is that the Holocaust wasn't a violation of German law, but that it was the violation of a law that is higher than German law, a law above the laws, a law greater than any kind of human laws. This is what Justice Robert Jackson argued in the courtroom at Nuremberg. First thing he says is, international law, natural law, German law, any law at all was to these men, the Nazi high command, simply a propaganda device to be invoked when it helped and to be ignored when it would condemn what they wanted to do. All he's saying here is that these are lawless men who make some kind of appeal to German law but don't actually really care about any laws. But he assumes that something is true when he makes this argument. that there is such a thing as international law and what he refers to as natural law. Of course, everybody knows that German laws existed, but in appealing to international law, he's suggesting not that international bodies have determined what various laws are. Those bodies didn't exist and or were toothless at the time of the Second World War. The League of Nations, as you know, was dead on arrival. But that there is a kind of law that applies to all nations at all times. That isn't actually necessarily encoded anywhere, but it exists. And then he refers to something he calls natural law, some kind of principle that is binding on any kind of inhabitant of the earth, and whatever laws that inhabitant is subject to, that this law is somehow a feature of the world around us, what he calls natural law. The second thing he says is this. He says that it was under the law of all civilized people a crime for one man with his bare knuckles to assault another. How did it come that multiplying this crime by 1,000,000 and adding firearms to bare knuckles made it a legally innocent act? He appeals to something there. That whatever laws you sit under, you have some kind of principle that exists in those laws. The basic principle of you can't assault somebody. Well, all you have in the Holocaust is a more mechanized and formalized version of assault on a grand scale. So this principle actually applies what philosophers would say, mutatis mutandis, to a much larger moral principle that applies to all peoples at all times. What Jackson is saying here is actually very interesting. He's saying that you all have this moral intuition that assault is wrong. And this explains why we can say holocausts are wrong. And we don't have to have a law against holocausts to be able to make that claim. The third thing he says is this: to start or wage an aggressive war has the moral qualities of the worst of crimes. The refuge of the defendants, the Nazi High Command, can be only their hope that international law will lag so far behind the moral sense of mankind that conduct which is a crime in moral sense must be regarded as innocence in law. We challenge that proposition. This is interesting too. When Jackson makes this argument, what he says is that there are some kind of attempts to develop an international law that are out there. But what he says is that the problem that is possible in a courtroom like what was happening at Nuremberg is that international law would lag behind the moral sense of mankind. This is an interesting phrase. He's appealing to this idea that all humanity has some kind of common moral sense. International law, he says, could lag behind this, but it doesn't challenge the existence of this moral sense that everybody has. Well, of course, the Nazi High Command, they were found guilty at Nuremberg, not because they violated German law, but because they violated the law above the law, one which we have access to via moral intuition. Okay, so we talked about the problem of cultural relativism is that it begs the question. We talked about how it makes a criticism of other cultures impossible. What are some other problems with moral relativism? Well, another problem is that the normative thesis, remember, what is moral differs from culture to culture and age to age. The normative thesis entails that moral reformers are immoral.
Yeah.
Consider Martin Luther King in the American South in the 50s and 60s. What is it that is believed to be moral? Sorry, I'm back at the descriptive thesis over here. What is that is believed to be moral in the American South in the 50s and 60s? You can hear this summarized by a gubernatorial and then presidential candidate, George Wallace. Segregation now, or segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. If you were to count noses in the American South around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, you would have found that all in all things being equal, what is believed to be moral in that culture is that segregation is a social good.
At least amongst the white people who you would be polling.
That's right, yeah. Yeah. But even then, no, that's actually good. That's a good way to frame it, Carl. Because white people were still the numerical majority, and so if you polled all people, you would still, if you're counting noses.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're still like raising hands on this issue, you would still have the consensus would be there, or at least the preponderance would be there. Okay, so that just underscores the point. Now, what does that mean about Dr. King? Well, Dr. King comes into this culture in which it is believed to be moral that segregation is a social good, and he challenges the premise. Well, what does that mean with respect to the normative thesis? Well, the normative thesis says that what is moral differs from culture to culture and age to age. So that means, according to his culture at his time, which is not just what people believed, but it was the case that Dr. King was a moral reprobate in his culture. Not just that it was believed that he was a moral reprobate, that's easy, but that he actually was a moral reprobate, and that's absurd. Right. So moral reformers would have to be immoral. Another problem with moral relativism is that the normative thesis, that again, what is moral differs from culture to culture and age to age, this leads to what I like to call moral anarchy. Think about this concept of culture for just a minute. Some of you might be like me. My family's been in the United States for a long time. My grandmother was Australian, but really, been here since the 1700s. For me, determining which culture I'm a part of is a fairly simple enterprise. However, some of you are second or third culture kids. You come from immigrant families, let's say. Now, let's imagine that you are, let's say, Vietnamese, and you're living in Sheridan, Colorado. Okay, so Sheridan's just down the road from us here, a little town. In Sheridan, there's a large number of immigrants. There's a lot of immigrant communities in Sheridan. There's a large Vietnamese community. There's a large Ethiopian community, although the larger Ethiopian community is out in Aurora. A lot of African Americans and especially a lot of Hispanics in Sheridan. Now, your family has immigrated here from Vietnam, let's say, and you know that your parents have a very firm sense of what their culture is. They're Vietnamese. But you've grown up here. America's the only country you've ever known. Maybe your folks speak Vietnamese at home, but everywhere else you speak English. Now let's say that you go to a high school and the majority of the students at your high school are Hispanic. Which culture are you a part of? To which culture do you belong? According to which moral code is it correct for you to act? Not do you prefer to act? According to which moral code is it correct for you to act? This is moral chaos. You can see how this devolves into anarchy very quickly. So most cultural relativists have actually abandoned relativism, cultural relativism, in favor of moral subjectivism. That is just kind of individualized. Whatever is good for me is good for me. Whatever is good for you is good for you. However, this is incredibly problematic because as soon as you accept moral subjectivism, all you have to do is have a Ted Bundy. Somebody who says, it is good for me to take life indiscriminately. Not, I prefer to take life indiscriminately. Of course, Ted Bundy preferred to do that. But that it is good for me to take life indiscriminately. Now, of course, you might qualify. Okay, well, whatever is good for you is good for you, and whatever is good for me is good for me, as long as we're not hurting anybody, right? Well, then you become a moral objectivist. It is wrong for all peoples at all times to harm other people, at least innocent ones. That's exactly what we're trying to establish here. There is such a thing as an objective moral law. You know it and I know it. Absurdity number 2. What is moral could potentially change over time with the winds of political power. That seems to be exactly what Hermann Goering was attempting to argue for, right? He's saying, I'm in prison because you won and we lost. What is moral could potentially change over time with the winds of political power. Well, of course, the resolution on Absurdity 1 challenges this. However, it's helpful to think a little bit about the distinction between political law, that is the law of the land, the law that's enforced by law enforcement, and the moral law. There's a distinction between the two. That's an important distinction for us to get our heads around. You might think about it this way. Is it possible for you to legislate morality? That's interesting. What do you think about that? Is it possible to legislate morality?
Yes.
Yeah, how so?
Yeah, I would say yes. I think the law and morality are like intertwined so much that you cannot separate the two. So your laws should be morality, really. You should try to legislate morality.
Okay. So give me an example. Or feel free somebody else to help them out and do
Can't
it.
murder somebody.
Yeah, you can't murder someone.
Okay, but
Can't
that doesn't mean
kidnap
that you love innocent life. It just means that you've avoided murdering somebody, right?
Laws, they don't change the morality, but they can enforce it. Like with murder, right? You can say, we'll pass a law that says, if you murder somebody, you go to prison for life. That doesn't change the fact that murder's wrong. But it does help reduce the amount of murders.
Yeah. Which is a more word you could say, yes.
I'd say morality is, I've heard it at least said this way, and I agree with it. Morality is the only thing we can legislate,
How so?
right? We have laws against murder, we have laws on what's good and right. When it comes to criminal law, they're all laws based on morality.
Yeah.
And that's the only thing we can legislate to.
What about which side of the road one should drive on?
Some laws are arbitrary by nature, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all laws have complete moral authority. Some laws vary state to state, not because that they prescribe a moral absolute, but rather because of the fact that that just works for that particular situation. In addition, Thomas Aquinas argues that law is supposed to be pedagogic.
Yeah.
That being that it's supposed to act as a teacher, but not necessarily like you can't just make like, oh, you said a cuss word, you're going to jail.
Yeah. Well, so this is an interesting thing, and I set up this question. You might even accuse me of committing the fallacy of a false question, because it's a little bit of a weak question, honestly. Can you legislate morality? But it's a common question that people ask. You're absolutely correct. When you make a law against murder, you are legislating morality. One ought not to murder, and we're encoding that in the law. Now, can you make somebody the kind of person that values life and loves life? Well, according to Thomas Aquinas, you actually might be able to a little bit. Law does have a pedagogical effect. And I mentioned the example of traffic laws on purpose. Traffic laws are arbitrary in a way. We could have done it otherwise. But what is the moral principle that traffic laws encode? One ought to operate dangerous machinery in such a way as to minimize the loss of innocent life.
Yeah.
That's a moral law, right? Now, which side of the road we decide to drive on, that's maybe a little bit arbitrary. But the moral law itself is not. So yeah, law does have a kind of pedagogical value to it. Did you want to add something?
Well, we drive on the right side of the road because that's the right way to do it, actually. It's in the name. Like, are we really debating that point? Because it's in the
Japanese
name.
would disagree with you.
Has anybody driven on the left side of the road before?
It's very hard.
It's very
Only brick.
it's very difficult. Yeah, I drove all throughout southern England in a car where I was on the right side of the car, driving on the left hand side of the road, and it was disorienting. Yes.
What about the 10 Commandments? They're teaching, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah. What's your question?
I was just-
Mr. Commandment?
I was just gonna say that as an example.
Yeah. Ten Commandments surely were a kind of civic law for the Jewish people. And the 10 Commandments, they have a place inside of Torah to tell people that these are moral limits for you. But they do have a kind of pedagogical effect, and the Westminster Catechism actually shows this. That when you have the 10 Commandments, what you have is, let's say, a law against covetousness. Well, what kind of principle does that engender to those who learn about the 10 Commandments? It teaches them that your desire to have more and more and more is actually a bad thing for you. And there's a number of things that come from that. Not only that you can't steal your neighbor's property, but you shouldn't be the kind of person who wants to amass such great wealth that all you want is more and more and more, right? That's a problem. So yeah, that's a good question. Okay. Now, it is true.
There's one kind of point of confusion that I think comes up when people use the phrase, you can't legislate morality, is the idea that making laws doesn't make people moral. Right, I think that was part of your point.
It doesn't make somebody love the good.
Yeah,
Yeah, which I think is depending on your moral vision, it may not be that big of a problem. But yes, you can't make somebody love innocent life by making murder illegal.
Yeah. But
it is true that if you live in a culture where murders are rare, it's more likely that people will have a respect for innocent life than they don't.
but then the absurdity becomes, okay, so if you take that view, okay, this law, establishing this law isn't gonna make people moral, what then? We shouldn't be making laws?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we should stop protecting innocent life. Well, and that's a good point, because I mean all laws in some way will at least touch on some kind of moral issue. So we can't make people moral people, but we can limit them from doing bad things. Now the law and morality, though, they do diverge at different points. This is important. This is where you say, like, they're very intertwined, and they are. But some things are legal and immoral. For example, gossip is legal and immoral, right? Pornography is legal and immoral. Law can't legislate our attitudes or our thoughts either, like we've been talking about. Okay, well, let's say you come to the conclusion that what is moral could potentially change over time with the winds of political power. Well, this would entail this absurd conclusion. You would have to believe that slavery was objectively good at time t1 and became objectively evil at time t2. That's absurd. Okay. It violates the law of non-contradiction. Okay, there's a better way, I think. There is such a thing as objective morality, and there is broad cultural agreement over time on some basic moral principles. Lying, for example, I've given a couple of these in your notes here. There's a Hindu principle that a sacrifice is obliterated by a lie and the merit of alms by an act of fraud. In Babylonian laws, there was the principle, whose mouth full of lying avails not before thee, thou burnest their utterance. It's an appeal to the gods there. I have not spoken falsehood, coming from the confession of the righteous soul, an Egyptian text. I have sought no trickery, nor swore false oaths. This is Anglo-Saxon from the epic Beowulf. All of these are different moral utterances from different cultures at different times. And yet they're all triangulating in on the same basic moral principle. All things being equal, don't lie. Mercy, showing mercy to those who are suffering. Again, a Hindu principle, the poor and the sick should be regarded as lords of the atmosphere. Babylonian list of sins, he has failed to set the prisoner free. Ancient Egyptian code, I have given bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, clothes to the naked, a ferry boat to the boatless. That's interesting. Old Norse, there, Thor, you got disgrace when you beat women. Again, different cultures at different times, different law codes that all triangulate on a basic moral principle. Show mercy to those who are suffering. Now, natural law, this concept of natural law that Justice Jackson appeals to in the Nuremberg trial, this is actually explained by something in Christian theology that I think is really helpful. Natural law helps to explain why there is often cultural agreement on broad moral principles. Consider Romans 2. This is verse 13 to 15. For it is not those who hear the law, they're talking about the Jewish moral law, or the Jewish law, the Torah. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles, who do not have Torah, they do not have the law, do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Their consciences also bearing witness, their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. The idea in Romans 2 is that all humanity is responsible before God for answering to God for the moral law that they have access to, whether it's through Torah or the law that's written on their hearts, but everybody has access to it. So there is such a thing as objective morality, and we need a grounding for it. We need a grounding for our moral intuitions, and I've given a couple of versions of the moral argument here. Version 1 is from C.S. Lewis, where he makes a certain kind of case that I feel compelled to act in a certain way, and other people feel the same way. Now, when I notice something that applies to me and therefore applies and also happens to apply to other people, I can see a kind of law-like behavior not just in that relationship, but in the relationship between the non-human universe and how it acts. That is, when you see an internal rule being followed in some way in the natural world, you can say, well, then if that rule is always followed, then there is some kind of law that guides the development of that principle in the natural world. Well, if I'm noticing that I have a certain compulsion to act in a certain way, and other humans feel the same kind of thing, then there must be a common director behind my feelings that are similar to my neighbor's feelings, and the physical compulsion that lives in the universe that guards natural laws. This common director is what Lewis would call God. A more straightforward version of the argument, I think, is found in Moreland and Craig, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. If God does not exist, then moral values and duties do not exist. The reason for that is you have a problem of a cosmic says who. If you say murder is wrong, all you have to do is say says who. Well, objective moral values and duties do exist. The Nazis did evil things. Therefore, God exists. So there is objective morality. We need a grounding for it, and I think we have that in God. But just as importantly, there's a cure for our moral brokenness. The Christian perspective on reality is that while many of us have never broken the kind of moral law in the same way as the Nazis did, we've broken God's law through doing what we ought not to do and leaving undone what we ought to have done. We choose selfishness, greed, pride, and there's no way out of our moral depravity. But God himself became a victim of our worst evils in Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus was a victim of racism under the Romans, injustice and hatred from the Jewish religious establishment. He was a victim of violence and shunning by those he loved. He dies on a Gentile cross under Jewish judgment and Roman power in order to forgive us of our sin and heal us from our brokenness. And he's risen from the dead in order to show that his new way to be human will bring about complete justice and reconciliation for all people if we're willing to repent and believe the good news. Let it be so. Amen. All right, what thoughts and questions do you have?
How many of you have seen the movie Nuremberg, the most recent version? Seriously.
When did it come out?
It came out this last fall. It's out of theaters now, so you have to go online.
I watched
they're
it on
gonna-
Amazon.
They're gonna charge you a wad to watch it. They do this thing now, stuff right out of the theater, it's gonna cost you $20. But you know, if a couple of you get together, it's the same price as going to the movie. I would highly recommend that you watch it. There are some really interesting interchanges in the movie that are getting at the central question about where does evil come from. There's interesting turning points. There's one interchange between Jackson and the Pope, because they're kind of trying to establish, they recognize there's no precedence for this kind of trial ever. How can we do this? And so you have to get this kind of like approval of governments. But they're thinking, okay, we've got the Russians, we've got the French, we've got the English, we've got the Americans. Is that enough? And they're thinking, no, it's not enough. So who do they go to? They go to the Pope. And what do you think the Pope's first response is to that? He says, no, we will not support it. And do you know why? It's because he asked Jackson why he thinks this is right. And what Jackson appeals to is humanity. So the Pope says, yeah, we can't go with that. But then he flips it on him. He says, well, if you don't do this, then you are approving what they did in those Nazi concentration camps.
Which is material because the Pope, when he was a cardinal, had signed a concordat with the Nazis to protect the autonomy of the German Catholic Church.
Right.
So you've probably heard of this Pope before. I can't remember his name, I'm shoot if I forget, but you could look it up and look at the Pope during World War II. He had formed an agreement with the Nazis to protect German Catholics and therefore sort of endorsed their actions in the final solution.
So interesting one, and I don't wanna get, no spoiler alerts, but even the psychologist, he gets put to task.
Yep.
About evil, and he comes to an interesting conclusion about evil. We're all culpable. There wasn't something that set the Germans apart from everybody else. We could all be the same. So I'd highly recommend the movie. It's a very thoughtfully done movie. I don't agree with everything in the
The movie does not explain Jackson's appeal to natural laws.
No, he doesn't. The
Which is a
original
big omission.
the original Nuremberg movie did a good job
Yeah.
of that one, the one that was made back in the 50s. But they kind of waffle on that.
Yeah, it's like if you saw Dunkirk. Dunkirk leaves out the fact that the British people were all called to pray for weather, so that they could get their 300,000 troops out of northern France. That totally leaves out the prayer and the miracle of the change in the weather.
Yeah.
But such as Hollywood. Yes, I think you had a thought.
Well, first of all, the Pope did not condone the actions, and the Catholic Church was the single greatest force in preventing Jews from being persecuted, and many Jews afterwards did convert to Catholicism for exactly the reason that the Catholic Church actually did help them out. So I do call bullshit that the Pope was somehow aligned with.
Not in his actions as Pope. As a cardinal, you can look it up. He signed a concordat with the Nazis that allowed for Nazi action in and around Catholic churches and endorsed the Nazi government as a legitimate government. And what was given in return was the German Catholic Church to remain more or less autonomous over its own theology.
In fairness, when he signed that, he didn't really realize
Yeah,
what he
of
was
course not.
signing up for.
Of course not. No.
So he wasn't
That's
endorsing.
just him protecting his own church's religious
correct.
freedom.
However, what history would show, and this is how Jackson gets the Pope over the barrel and gets him to agree to support the trial, is what history is going to show, is at the get-go, you supported the Nazi, you endorsed the Nazi government.
And don't take what I'm saying as anti-Catholic. The Roman Catholic Church has been one of the greatest forces for good and continues to be one of the greatest forces for good
Sure.
in the world today.
Yeah.
So I'm Catholic educated. I went, my advisor at Regis University was a Jesuit priest, and he got me close. I didn't convert, but I love Roman Catholics. So that's not the point. The point isn't an anti-Catholic thing. It was that there was some bad judgment shown in the signing of the Concordat. Is all I'm saying. Yes.
When we talk about like the law being written on our hearts still today, what would you say is that law that is written on our hearts? Is it specifically the 10 Commandments? Is it the principles set forth in the Bible? What is that?
Yeah. I don't think it's all of the principles that are set forth in the Bible, because natural law needs, and back to Thomas Aquinas, you got me on this, I like Thomas Aquinas, that nature needs grace. So you have to have some kind of what we would call in the more Protestant ways, is that you have general revelation, which is God's revelation to all peoples at all times in the moral law, but it needs special revelation to elucidate the nature of general revelation. So I think there's some basic moral principles, that a couple that I already pulled out here. I think we have a basic idea that lying is bad. Maybe not lying under all circumstances, but all things being equal, we should tell the truth. That innocent life is to be cared for. That we should respect our elders. That's one that you see. It's very common in cultures around the world today, or not just today, throughout history. Respecting your elders, especially a concern for children and women in terms of their vulnerability, so that there's a principle that we should try to protect the most vulnerable in society. And I think you can look at what are those moral laws. If you're looking at those, I think it's appropriate to put on the hat of an anthropologist or a sociologist and think about what are the things that people really care about. one thing that I think is interesting about this moral law, you've heard me talk about the book Dominion before in this group by Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, but the British historian Tom Holland. He applies this to a couple of test cases because what he wants to argue in that book is that the Christian moral vision has actually shaped Western values, the Judeo-Christian moral vision. And he even talks about things like debates over the nature of marriage between one man and one woman, the possibility of at-will divorce, or divorce on demand, you might say, and then debates over same-sex marriage. And he suggests a common moral principle that applies to all of those. And the common moral principle is that love is an inherent good, and love is to be celebrated. Now, I think people who are on either side of that debate may equivocate on what we mean by that. However, there is something there that is worth, I think, looking deeper into, is that people on both sides of that debate appeal to love in some way. Whether love in terms of how it was designed and revealed in the scriptures, or love in terms of how we can see it embodied in various kinds of non-traditional relationships. That there is still something valuable about self-giving care and regard for the other, without necessarily any promise of return. That's an interesting idea. Just leave that there.
What if to answer your question, what if you reduce the 10 to 2, which Jesus did?
Yeah, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. Yeah, the Westminster Confession doesn't do that, but I always didn't like it because of that. And I'm an Arminian anyway, so I don't have to like the Westminster Confession. But they try to hang all commandments on the 10. But I think the 10 are really reduced down to the 2, like Jesus says. And I think you could see that with the first 4 and the last 6. Yeah. Yeah. What other thoughts do you have?
Well, thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thank you all very much.
So, just a quick reminder for y'all, no meeting next week. We will be whiteboarding on next Friday, the 23rd. We'll be either outside or inside, we don't know yet, so.
Weather dependent.
We're weather dependent, so more details to come on that. And then we also have the Spring Enrollment Fair this Thursday from 5 to 7. Where is that?
It's in the Green Center.
Green
and
Center.
What's
So-
the room? The
Friedhof.
Friedhof.
Okay, so we will be tabling for that, so feel free to stop by, say hi, and give us a quick chat, and definitely recommend us too, and hopefully we'll get some good conversations going. So I will pray everyone out, and then you are free to go. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time with Ike and this night. I hope that everyone had a wonderful start to their semester. It's always such a pleasure to just be reminded of your love for us, and even though your law is to protect us and to do good, we do come short of it, and of course, fault of our own, we're fallen, and we need you to redeem us, and we are so grateful for your sacrifice and for taking upon all of the punishment that we deserve, but that you took upon yourself to free us from our shortcomings. So I just thank you for that humbly before you, and I pray that everyone will have a wonderful semester coming from this first day, and that safe travels for everyone, and that we'll be hopefully getting some more traction this semester and more following, and that we'll be able to do your will to the best of our ability this week and this semester, and as we go forth with this new knowledge. So thank you. Amen.
Amen. Eat snacks. We have plenty of cookies
Food
and donuts.
hand talk.
Definitely get some of the donuts though.
It's like your name the whole time. What?
I don't think it's supposed to.
Andrew I. Shepardson.
Wait, is 8:30 not our normal time?
Well, I came up because I wanted to ask you. My name is James Wagner.
You know, time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah. I wanted to ask because I'm interesting apologetics. You see it's in a lot. So, have you heard of psychophysical harmony?
I think
Yeah,
both
it's
the old government got